Timothy was a father to 5 young children, and he was not a nice person. He was not a nice dad. He was controlling, he was manipulative, and he was very abusive. Even in his teenage years, we're seeing a lot of dysfunction, a lot of alcohol abuse, brutal boot camp prison regimes. And unfortunately, all of this, especially the prison boot camp, would definitely shape Timothy's character going forward. So it's now 2003. Timothy is currently 21 years old, which I cannot get over how young he is, and he has gone through so much. So he's currently just got out of prison, and he thinks, right, it's finally time to turn my life around. And this is when Timothy finds religion. He joins a Pentecostal church that has Christian fundamentalist beliefs. He also goes on to college. He gets a degree in computer engineering. He finds himself a good job that pays pretty well. And he also meets his future wife, Amber. And within weeks, Timothy has already proposed to Amber. Within 6 weeks of meeting, Timothy and Amber were married. The couple quickly go on to have 3 children together. Timothy finds a new job. It's actually a very well-paid job, this next job. He finds a job at the tech giant Intel, and he's on an $80,000 a year salary. And this is where the whole family move from Mississippi to Lexington in South Carolina, and the family move into a trailer. And at first, everything seemed great. Everything seemed to be going great for Amber, but then everything began to change. And this was all because of the strict religious code that Timothy lived by. And he started to impose these strict rules on Amber. He told her that she needed to be a subservient wife. She was no longer allowed to wear makeup. She wasn't allowed to cut her hair. She wasn't even allowed to wear trousers. She was expected to stay at home, quit her job. She wasn't allowed to have a job. She was expected to clean the house, basically be a housewife, and give birth to kids. That is all she was good for, taking care of the home and giving birth to children. And she also needed to stop spending so much time with friends and family. She basically had to give up any life or identity that she had before Timothy. She was expected to do everything that her husband wanted and needed. Meanwhile, Timothy could do whatever he wanted. He didn't follow any of these rules himself. And if Amber ever stepped out of line, Timothy would be physically violent towards her. So now Timothy has become an abuser himself. So we now get to 2011. Timothy is almost 30 years old, and the 3 children are getting a little bit older now. And this is when Timothy is reported for the first time to the Department of Social Services, which is something that would be reoccurring a lot from this moment on. Timothy was first reported to the DSS for very violent and volatile behavior towards his neighbors. And in one instance, which is probably the incident that got him reported, he got into an argument with one of his neighbors, and it got that heated that Timothy threatened to shoot his neighbor's dog. So Timothy was reported, and the DSS came out, and they didn't find any signs or any evidence of physical abuse towards the children at this point. However, they did notice that the home was a mess. It was absolutely filthy. It was disgusting. Also, the children's clothes were dirty. The children were dirty. The DSS took one look around and said, this needs to change. And because of this report, the family were set up with a so-called safety plan. But unfortunately, this so-called safety plan was never followed up on. Things at the home just continued on the way they were. So it's around 2012 now, and Amber has had 2 more children. And throughout the years, even more reports were made to the DSS. Every time someone from the DSS came out, evaluated the situation, said that things needed to change, set up a so-called safety plan, and then that was it. Safety plan was never followed up on. No one ever went back out to the house as a follow-up, nothing. Most of the reports actually were related to Amber and the domestic violence towards Amber, not the children. And a lot of the time it was actually Amber that was reporting Timothy to the DSS. So this all started when the family were out shopping, and whilst they were out shopping, Timothy and Amber had started arguing. And this argument followed them in the car on the way home. So they're driving home, they're driving very, very fast, and Timothy turns to Amber and says, "Do you want to play chicken?" On the other side of the road, Timothy sees a huge 18-wheeler truck. So Timothy, seeing this 18-wheeler approaching, swerves the car onto the other side of the road, making sure that only the passenger side of the car is on the other side of the road. And the passenger side of the car is directly lined up with the 18-wheeler. I also want to point out that the children are in the back of the car. Amber, the children, everyone is screaming, apart from Timothy. Obviously, he's having the time of his life right now. Amber is yelling at Timothy to stop, to get on the right side of the road. And Timothy, the whole time, is just laughing. He's driving faster and faster towards this 18-wheeler truck. And then at the very last second, Timothy swerves back onto the right side of the road. They were literally seconds from a severe accident that would have killed everyone in the car. Timothy every day is becoming more violent, more volatile. So we now get to the summer of 2012, and Amber at this point had just had enough. After years of being abused, after being isolated from everyone, manipulated, forced to give up her life, her identity, Amber started a relationship with a neighbor. Now, it didn't take long, of course, for Timothy to find out about this. After he did, he was furious, because obviously he expected Amber to be this subservient wife, and unsurprisingly, Timothy reacted in a very extreme way. He just gathered up all his belongings, packed up his bags, and left, and took all 5 children with him. He traveled back to Mississippi to live closer to family, and he left Amber behind in South Carolina. Timothy then blocked Amber having access with the children at all. Timothy ended up filing for divorce and asking for custody of all 5 children. Now, when Timothy was asked the reason for the divorce, he said that Amber was having an affair and, quote, kept a sloppy home. Amber did try to fight the case, but because she didn't have a job, remember, this was all because of Timothy that she didn't have a job. She didn't have any money to hire an attorney. She also didn't have any connections with friends and family. She had cut off ties completely to her old life because of Timothy. She had no way, at least she felt like she had no way to fight this. There was also a part of her, though, that did think that Timothy would be a good dad. He would look after the children, and maybe the children would be better off with him because he had a job. He had a very well-paying job. And she thought, well, I don't have a job. I don't have any money. I can't provide for the children. So maybe they would be better off with Timothy, which obviously that is not the case. But that all comes down to the fact that she has been abused and manipulated for all of those years. And eventually, in late 2013, Timothy won the case and he won custody of all 5 children. Amber was allowed visitation every other weekend and on a few holidays. So at some point after getting custody of the 5 children, Timothy and the 5 children do move back to the trailer in Lexington, South Carolina. Obviously, Amber is not there right now. And he was now raising all 5 children alone without Amber. So the 5 children were Mara, aged 8, Elias, aged 7, Nathan, aged 6, Gabriel, aged 2, and Elaine, aged 1. Timothy was now sending his children to school because prior to this, they were homeschooled. Timothy actually made Amber homeschool the children, even though she had no qualifications and she didn't feel comfortable with homeschooling the children. And unfortunately, this is when Timothy's terrible behavior started to escalate as well. His and alcohol usage really increased at this time. He was becoming more and more volatile, and he had also become physically abusive to the children. This all started because Timothy had started to enforce stricter methods of punishment and control. Now, previously, all of this was focused on Amber. He was physically abusing Amber, controlling Amber, enforcing these very strict rules on Amber, and it was all on Amber. The children, as far as I'm aware anyway, never actually suffered at the hands of Timothy. But now Amber's gone, so he no longer has Amber to take out his frustrations on. So now he's turned his frustrations onto his children. He would force the children to do push-ups, squats, extreme forms of exercise for children. He would also make the children stand on their tiptoes for hours, and he would make the children do hundreds of squats, hundreds of push-ups, and this is extreme for anyone but for children. And if Timothy wasn't satisfied that the children had learnt their lesson from the extreme exercise, he would resort to physical violence. There were times when Timothy would drag the children around the house. He would whip them repeatedly with belts. He would choke the children. He would also throw them up against the wall. Food was also being withheld from the children as well. The children were barely being fed. They were lucky if they got one meal a day. And when they were fed oatmeal. That was the only thing in the house ever. On other occasions, Timothy would bring home a McDonald's, but he would bring home one chicken nugget meal for all 5 children to share between themselves. So things have really escalated here. This is extreme child abuse and neglect. And all of this was being noticed by other people. Timothy wasn't hiding any of this. He didn't care if the children had bruises on them. He didn't care who saw. The children would arrive at school with bruises on their face, necks, arms, and the teachers would ask the children, "How did you get these bruises?" And the children would openly say that their dad did it. The teachers, of course, reported Timothy to the DSS, with one report from a teacher saying that they found a hand-sized bruise on one of the children. But tragically, this report was never followed up on. What's new? Every report that was made was either never followed up on, or someone from the DSS would go out, they would make a report, and then that wouldn't get followed up on. But it wasn't just the teachers that were noticing the abuse. The babysitters were too. One time, the family went to Disneyland, and I was actually shocked when I read that. I was like, what? They actually went to Disneyland? Because that does not sound like Timothy. And on the way to Disneyland, the children were getting a little bit restless in the car, and Timothy was annoyed at this. So he pulled over and made the children do squats on the side of the road. And then when they arrived at the hotel, the babysitter witnessed Timothy spanking his children. The babysitter was absolutely traumatized by this because she had never actually witnessed this herself before. The babysitter as well would feed the children in secret. The children would say to the babysitter, "Please don't tell my dad that you fed me, because if he's found out that you fed me, he won't give us any more food." And it's just absolutely heartbreaking. And of course, the babysitter never told their dad that she had fed them. And the babysitter approached Timothy a number of times about the food, about how he would discipline the children, but every time Timothy would just fly off the handle and say, "These are my kids. I discipline them how I want to." Of course, the babysitter did report Timothy to the DSS multiple times, and again, nothing was ever done. There was one time where someone from the DSS actually bothered to go out, because most of the time they never did, and a caseworker saw with their own eyes bruises on the children. But once again, the case was closed and nothing was done. And I'm sorry, are you being serious? Right now, a caseworker went out and visibly saw with their own eyes bruises on the children, and nothing gets done. Abuse can sometimes be hidden very well, but when it's staring you in the face, why are you not doing anything? There were so many opportunities for the Department of Social Services to step in. Literally everyone is telling them Timothy is not a good person. Amber was telling them ages ago. We now have teachers phoning. We now have babysitters phoning. These children needed immediate intervention. They needed to be removed from that home. And I just want to point out here that the DSS were contacted a total number of 12 times. 12 separate times, which means that there were 12 opportunities for something to be done here, but every time nothing was ever done. And very tragically, just days after the last visit from that DSS caseworker, that is when the tragic events of today's case take place. On the 28th of August 2014, Timothy found his 6-year-old son Nathan playing with an electrical socket. Now, I should point out at this time that all children had expressed that they didn't want to live with their dad anymore. All of the children had expressed that they wanted to live with their mom. Timothy was absolutely outraged by this. How dare the children want to live with their mom? Timothy actually started to believe that the children were conspiring against him to bring him down. Now, this to me sounds absolutely absurd. The ages of the children are 1, 2, 6, 7, and 8. How are children of that age conspiring together to bring down one of their parents? Earlier on, I did say that Timothy was suffering from paranoia, so I don't know if that has something to do with this, because it's absolutely absurd to think that these children are conspiring against anyone. So Timothy found his son, Nathan, playing with the electrical socket, and Timothy believed that his son was doing this intentionally to harm his dad. I don't know how he came to that conclusion. I don't know how a child playing with an electrical socket, which is obviously dangerous, they shouldn't be doing that, but I don't know how a child doing that means that they're going to harm a parent. Like, that just doesn't make sense, does it? And in response to this, Timothy enforced an absolute awful and brutal punishment. He told Nathan to get on the ground and do some push-ups. Then when he had finished the push-ups, he had to do squats. And there were other exercises that he was forced to do as well. And then once he had finished it all, he was made to do the cycle over and over and over and over again. He is 6 years old and he is being forced into doing exercise that is like a military boot camp. He was completely exhausted, dehydrated, fatigued, and whenever Nathan would show any signs of slowing down, Timothy would whip him, forcing him to continue. And this went on for hours. He was forced to exercise for hours, and Nathan was pleading with his dad to let him stop. But Timothy would not give in. He just kept beating Nathan every time he pleaded to stop. So the exercise continued, and it continued until Nathan actually collapsed. And Timothy just then picked up Nathan and carried him into his room and put him on his bed. And he just left him there. And when Timothy went to check on Nathan a few hours later, very sadly, Nathan had passed away. And he passed away from severe dehydration and exhaustion. And I just can't even find the words. I can't. He did not deserve that. It's incredibly heartbreaking. Can you imagine how painful that would have been? That is truly one of the worst acts of child cruelty I think I've ever come across. And it gets worse from here. It's like, how does it get worse? So when Timothy finds Nathan in his bedroom, he starts to panic. He knows that he's in serious trouble and he's likely to be prosecuted for this. So he starts evaluating his options. He first makes a Google search and ends up watching a video on prison rape. It's thought that he did this to get an idea of what prison life might be like for him. He also started to think about his other 4 children. He started to think about what's going to happen to them. If he gets sent to prison, who's going to get them? Well, the obvious answer is Amber. And Timothy could not bear the thought of Amber having custody of their children. He just couldn't even bear it. It made him so angry. And this is when Timothy came to the awful conclusion that the only way to do this was to the other 4 children. So throughout the evening, Timothy went around his 4 children and strangled them to death. The 2 older children, Mara and Elias, aged 8 and 7, he strangled with his own hands. But then when it came to the younger 2 children, Gabriel and Elaine, aged 2 and 1, he strangled them with a belt because his hands were too big for their small necks. And once again, I just have no words. Why did he come to that conclusion? Why? Why would he his other 4 children? I can't even imagine what those final moments would be for those 4 children. Following the confession, Timothy took the officers straight to where he abandoned his children. And they found the children in plastic bags decomposing just on the side of the road, which again shows absolutely zero remorse. The fact that he just abandoned his children on the side of the road. 5 years later, in April of 2019, Timothy would finally stand trial for his crimes. I am not quite sure why it took so long to go to trial, but Timothy did plead not guilty by reason of insanity. So I assume that is why. Timothy was saying that he had undiagnosed schizophrenia. He said that he was unable to tell right from wrong at the time of the murders, and he was definitely planting the seeds in his confession for an insanity plea. However, at trial, a psychiatrist came to the conclusion that he both legally and morally knew what he was doing was wrong. He didn't have schizophrenia, and he was actually faking symptoms of schizophrenia. I imagine he was hoping that he would get away with this plea because, if you remember, his mom has schizophrenia. The prosecution argued that Timothy took very deliberate steps to cover up what he did. And in the end, the jury agreed. After 6 hours of deliberation, the jury found Timothy guilty of all 5. And on the 13th of June 2019, Timothy Jones Jr. was sentenced to death.